So just to start, I would like to say welcome, welcome, welcome everyone today to this webinar exploring the predictions and implications of the 2024 European Parliament elections. My name is Dr. Giada Lagana, and I am a Liverpool Early Career Fellow and a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University. For the past 2 years, I've had the pleasure to be the president of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies, which is co-hosting this event with the University Association for Contemporary European Studies. UACES and IACES have been working in collaboration on a joint seminar series for several years now, entitled The UK, Ireland and the European Union in a Time of Crisis. These important and timely initiatives brings together scholars from across these islands and beyond to consider and reflect on common crises, share the challenges and emerging opportunities for collaboration and cooperation. Today's webinar is part of this series, and I would like really to take the opportunity to thank Oliver Pilkington, UACES Events and Membership Manager, for his incredible commitment and devotion to keep IACES and UACES partnership as fruitful as it has been over the past 3 years. We are both delighted to be joined on this virtual stage by amazing experts who will each bring a unique perspective in reflecting to the upcoming European Parliament election. So, in no particular order, I would like to introduce Professor Daniela Brown. She's Professor of Political Science with a focus on European integration and international relations at Saarland University. In her research, she focuses on topics from the field of EU politics, European elections, European parties, and the European party system, as well as citizens and voters and their attitudes and behaviors in the European multi-level system. Dr. Catherine Simpson from Keele University. She is an expert primarily in European politics, Brexit, political behavior, and political economy. She's elected the Secretary and Trustee of UACES, Deputy Director of the Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence, and the series editor of the European Politics series published by Manchester University Press. And tomorrow she is launching her latest book, Nationalism in Internationalism, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Then we'll have Will Daniel, who is Associate Professor in Comparative Politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. Will is interested in how personal backgrounds and institutional contexts shape political careers, particularly in legislative and party politics. He has written broadly on careers in Europe and is especially interested in questions on gender and sexuality in political representation. He is an expert in European Union politics with an emphasis on the European Parliament and particular country expertise in French politics. He has also subject expertise and interest in political uses of social media and digital campaigns. And last but not least, Dr. Mary C. Murphy. She is the head of Department of Government and Politics at the University College Cork. She holds a Jean Monnet Chair in European Integration and is a senior lecturer in politics, specializing in the study of the European Union and Northern Ireland politics. Her primary area of research is Northern Ireland and the European Union and the dynamics of the relationship between subnational and EU politics. Her work incorporates multi-level governance and Europeanization literature in particular. Her second area of research interest concerns parliamentary socialization and parliamentary capacity building and is focused on examination of first-time DDs. Without further ado, I would like to ask to our panelists to start with a quick introduction, reflecting on how this European Parliament election could influence the future politics of the European Union, and possibly also bring forward 1 or 2 points that are particularly related to your expertise. Then I will follow up with one specific question for each one of you, and The section will then continue with a Q&A. So for our online audience, please feel free to put any questions into the chat, and I will make sure to refer everything back to the panelists during the Q&A. Or if you would like to be unmuted and to ask your question directly, just again, signal it into the chat, and I will make sure that me or Ollie will unmute you. Daniela, would you like to start? Followed then by Catherine, Will, and Mary. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for this very nice introduction, and also thanks a lot for inviting me to this very interesting event we are facing now. So we are really close now to the EP elections, which are going to take place in June this year. And as every time when we are facing EP elections, then all these events pop up, and also media start to report finally about European politics. In a way, that's good news, but in a way, I also, now, I would not say that I'm sick of it already, because I think I had this for the last two elections, which took place in 2014 and 2019. But I already realized that sometimes it's a bit tiring if only in these election years people are interested, and media is interested, and politicians are interested in European politics, whereas the rest of the time, so not in the election campaign period, European politics is just something not so important. So that's how I always, how I'm also interested in EP elections. When you asked me to think about how EP elections could influence the future politics of the EU, my first thought was, okay, maybe not in such a great way, or not in such a, there will be not so much impact, of course, because EP elections are not never really about European politics, but always much more about national politics. So this would be my first aspect. I will briefly go a bit into more detail in a second. And the second aspect I will try to present here in my introductory remark is then that, but of course, EP elections are important. We all know it. They are important. And of course, they have an impact on future politics of the EU, even if voters, but also parties, and in general, the media and policymakers think that these are not so important elections. I will start with my with the first aspect I'm focusing. So EP elections are never really about European politics, but much more about national politics. So why is this the case? I think most of you have already heard about this seminal research on EP elections as second-order elections. Reif and Schmidt and Hermann Schmidt, he was my former boss also at the University of Mannheim. He has written together with Karl-Heinz Reif this famous article in 1980 where they said that EP elections are second-order elections. They are less important elections simply because there is less at stake. So what does this mean? Less important elections is not that they are not at all important, but it's they are least important elections because there is less at stake compared to national elections. So whereas all politicians, all policymakers, the entire media would always focus on national elections in the national election campaign, the same is not true for European elections, and we can see this. So if we look into the past, first elections to the European Parliament in 1979, throughout the entire history of the EP elections until last time in 2019, we have seen that there was always a lower turnout compared to national elections. So people are less interested in these elections at the European level. They have the tendency to not to cast their vote in these elections, whereas they would do it in national elections. We can also see that government parties tend to rather lose compared to to national elections, and that also smaller and more extreme parties have the tendency to win compared to national elections. So all of this is what we really can always see when we look into EP elections, and I'm pretty sure that this is also happening this time. There will be lower turnout also in June this year compared to the national elections in each of the EU member states. It will be certainly the case that government parties in each of the EU member states will rather lose, and smaller and more extreme parties will rather win. But what are the implications of all of this? What does this second order election character really tell us about the nature of these elections, and also the nature then of the election campaign? So what we can see is that really not only voters are less interested in these elections, but also political parties are. We see this because they use less budget for their election campaigns compared to national elections. And also they rather focus on national political issues, and they tend to, I would not say maybe de-emphasize, but at least they do not really highlight European politics in their election campaign, but they focus more on national political issues. And all of this is a kind of a vicious circle. So EP elections are already labeled as the less important elections. Citizens know this, they do not really turn out in these elections, and then political parties are not so interested in all of this, and we'll have the same procedure in all of these elections. Which brings me to the final conclusion on this first aspect, that on the one hand, EP elections are not really about European politics, but more about national politics, and at the same time, they're not so interesting for the citizenry and also for policy makers than national elections are. But, and this is then of course important because I am studying in my own research EP elections, and I think that these are important elections. So I also agree that there might be an impact, of course, on future politics of the EU. The question is why? And my first answer, and I guess this would be also the standard answer, is that this is the only direct election at the EU level. So this is the only way to really participate from the perspective of the citizenry in these elections. It is also important that who are we voting in these elections? We are voting our future MEPs, and these future MEPs are our representatives at the EU level, and they are very much involved in decision-making in the European Union, and all of this has, of course, consequences. So these, I would say, are the standard answers to why are these elections important, and why there might be an impact also on of these elections on future politics of the EU. But there is an additional aspect, and this aspect is Eurosceptic parties. We have seen Eurosceptic parties winning. This Eurosceptic impact has started 10 years ago, and even a bit earlier, but for the first time in the elections, in the EP elections of 2014, we have seen huge Eurosceptic vote, and the same was true then in the last elections. And of course, these Eurosceptic parties, they are powerful now in the European Parliament, and they have a lot of impact on policy making, and not only on policy making, but they have also, and this is what we see from our research we are currently working on, that all of this has also an impact on the party positions by mainstream parties, that they are changing their positions also, which means that EP elections and the result of the EP elections will always have also consequences for EU politics. At the same time, it's the same procedure as every year, and every time these EP elections take place, they will be perceived in a different way than national elections. And because you asked also to maybe have a brief look into our own countries. And what I can say is that so far, I do not see so much in Germany on European politics. This will start maybe in a month or so when the real election campaign is going to start. But so far, there was mainly the question of the lead candidate from the European People's Party, because this is a German one. Ursula von der Leyen, our president of the European Commission, who will be also the lead candidate of the European People's Party. This was in the news. This was maybe important from the perspective of the media. Otherwise, we are mainly stuck, I would say, in our national politics situation right now. We have internal fights between the government and the opposition in Germany. We have internal fights within the government parties itself. And all of this, I think, will have a huge impact also on the EP election campaign. So we are still very, very much focused on national politics, and there is not so much European politics so far.
Thank you so much for these very interesting remarks. Catherine.
Thanks, Giada, and thank you very much to UACES and IACES for the invitation to speak at this event. It's always a privilege to be invited to these important events, especially this time, and it's really lovely to share the panel with such an esteemed experts. And I'm really, really pleased to see this collaboration going from strength to strength as well. So thank you very much. To kind of begin with, I just want to probably follow on really from what Daniela has already really discussed, and that is around that the way the 2024 European Parliament elections will be regarded. And I think we are definitely going to see a major shift to the right in many countries, with, I think, a lot of populist radical right parties gaining votes and gaining seats across the EU, and the centre left and green parties losing votes and seats. And I think this can be attributed, in my view and in my research, to a real mainstreaming of Euroscepticism across the EU since the 2014 European Parliament elections. I think Euroscepticism is often portrayed as kind of a marginal phenomenon, something kind of on, the periphery of society, within public attitudes, and very much the party system as well. But I think this has changed since three events in particular. I think you can track this change from the onset of the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. I also think you can attribute it to the migrant crisis, kind of very much at the height of in 2015, and to some extent Brexit. And I think these three events have triggered that fundamental attitude change, and we really may actually see that from an electoral perspective in these European Parliament elections this year. From an Irish perspective, and when I talk about Ireland, I'm obviously talking about the Republic of Ireland here, it's very interesting. There was a recent poll for the European Council on Foreign Relations predicting that Sinn Féin would double its vote kind of in the election, and enable the party to jump from 1 seat to 4 seats. And then Fine Gael is probably going to be the party that is predicted to slump the most by about 8%, and lead to a decrease in seats for that party from 5 to 2. And if this is the case, and I think it's a big if, but I don't think we can't discuss it, and I'm sure Mary will touch upon that as well, is that Ireland books the trend if this is the case, because an increase in Sinn Féin votes and seats in the European Parliament would actually see a shift to the left rather than the right. And I think this is where we can kind of track, what has changed in Ireland, and has there been almost kind of a Brexit effect in the European Parliament? And can that be seen in the European Parliament elections that are coming up? And I think, from one hand, yes, there is definitely a Brexit effect. In September 23, the European Parliament and the Council agreed to the provision of 15 extra MEPs, and 1 extra seat has been allocated to Ireland, meaning there'll be 14 MEPs as opposed to 13. And in November 2023, the Electoral Commission of Ireland recommended kind of a slight boundary change. So this is very kind of I suppose, very specific, but I'm sure you'll get it, is that the counties of Laois and Offaly would be transferred to the southern constituency of the Midlands Northwest, meaning that constituency now has 5 seats instead of 4. So if you think of Ireland, it's got 3 constituencies. Dublin has 4 seats, the Midland Northwest has 5, and the South has 5. And I think that's really important as we map on to how we kind of can maybe see voting patterns in Ireland and how that could be reflected in the European Parliament elections. I also think we kind of have to talk about the UK in this. And I feel we have to bring it in, because while the European Parliament elections are not being discussed in the UK at all, I can tell you that now, and I'm sure there's shock around the room by that, but they're not. But I think what's really important is that in the UK, the general election in 2024 will probably be one of the most significant elections in Europe in 2024. And anti-incumbency sentiment is very strong. And the expectation, at least at the moment, is that a Labour government will be returned. Now, the current Conservative government could theoretically delay any election till January 2025. To my mind, I think it's most likely to be autumn 2024. Don't bet your house on it, but maybe October. But the Conservative government has been in office for the last 14 years. The Labour Party is consistently polling at 20 percentage points and above. And I think even with a reduction in things like inflation, a stabilised economy, Labour are still expected to win a secure working majority. And while that's not going to kind of map onto a European Parliament and seats scenario, it certainly has an impact on how UK-Ireland relations could progress moving forward, and how potentially the UK will liaise and maybe change the relationship that they have with the European Union as a consequence of a changed government that is in power at the end of this year. So I think it's still very important that, despite the fact there's no European elections obviously in the UK, it's still very important to think about it in those terms and how that may impact that future relationship moving forward. Very, very quickly, I kind of want to touch upon how the European election really kind of should or perhaps could contribute to Ireland's place in the EU. And I think that the European Parliament election will be very much a litmus test of the key issues of concern for the Irish electorate ahead of the Irish general election. So the next general election to elect the 34th Dáil must be held by the 22nd of March 25. I think given the recent and very unforeseen resignation of Taoiseach Leo Varadkar last week, his successor as leader of Fine Gael and soon to be Taoiseach Simon Harris has said that he's ruled out an early election. He said he wants to see his government going to full term. Opposition parties are obviously crying out for an immediate election. On that basis, I would say watch this space. But I think that, to my mind, there are 3 key issues that Ireland has to contribute substantially, both to its electorate and also to work out really its new place in the EU. And I think that they focus on, and this is in order, housing, the cost of living, and immigration. I think those 3 issues are going to be very important in a European Parliament election, and goes back to Daniela's comments around Schmidt and Rive's second order. And that's how they will be a litmus test moving forward. And I can talk about them later, and I'll pass over to Giada. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, also for bringing in the big absent, the UK, that still always have, let's say, a looming shadow of influence on everything that happens in Europe as a whole. Will.
Great, thank you. Well, hello from the UK. So thanks very much to Giada for thinking of inviting me, and to Ollie for organizing this, as well as the other colleagues here on the panel and their many different views. So it's interesting to think about. So, I mean, disclaimer, I am in the UK, but I'm an American, so I'm very much a doubly outsider whenever it comes to observing the European Parliament elections, but I've been doing so now for quite some time. And I was thinking back to a panel I was on 10 years ago about the 2014 European elections and thinking about all of the big questions that would come out of it, and sort of similar to Daniela, thinking about, oh, I always have to bring out these sort of stories, and they are very much the same in some ways. I mean, we were thinking about migration back then, we're thinking about the rise of the far right, we're thinking about their impact on the institutions. And so in some ways, it could seem as if we were sort of coming back out of a time capsule, I suppose, in 2024 and having the same sorts of debates and conversations again as we have before. But I think what we've already heard from the colleagues, and where I would agree here, is that when we think about the European Parliament and we think about those who are in it and those who are campaigning, we have to always be very mindful about the backgrounds of those who are doing the campaigning and who are participating in the European discourse. And so, I've been thinking for some time now about the careers of members of the European Parliament and how that have changed since back in the 1970s and even earlier under the Assembly. But one thing that always strikes me is that we have to look for sort of the fingerprints of national politics and European politics. So as we were just hearing from Catherine about Ireland, we could say the same thing about French politics, which is something that I watch very closely and I'm interested in as well at a national level. And then we also have to look for fingerprints of sort of EU politics back in the member states that we're interested in and paying attention to. So I think what I would like to do with my couple of minutes is just to sort of say something about sort of three different narratives that I'm kind of keeping an eye on as we get into the campaign. One, which is sort of around the French politics narratives, the narratives of the debate within France, and then secondly about the narrative at the sort of EU level, and then thirdly within the European Parliament as an institution itself, because I think that there's an interesting mismatch here this time around in terms of what perhaps those in the Commission might say about the European Parliament elections and those in the Parliament might say about the European Parliament elections, and that's worth picking up on. So on the French side and on the national side, with my own mental map background as an American, I think very much in American politics about the relationship between presidential national years and midterm years. And so in a way, for the French politics example, I think that the European Parliament elections this time around are serving as a bit of a midterm election for the French national system, right? So, we're now a couple of years into Macron's second term. We've seen already the shuffling of cabinet, replacing of prime ministers. We have seen the sort of opposition that arose in the legislative elections from the left-wing coalition begin to lose a bit of its footing and trying to decide how unified it actually is in terms of legislative office. And so all of that spills over very nicely, or maybe not nicely, but very messily, and interestingly, into the European campaign. And so we have essentially surrogates of each of the national parties that are going to be leading the different European Parliament list. We have, of course, Macron's surrogate, Valérie Gaillet, who's running for, of course, the Renaissance list, or the sort of centrist list. But then, interestingly enough, we have some very national figures who are jumping back into European Parliament politics, particularly from the far right. So list leaders and very high up important figures like Jordan Bardella from the Rassemblement National running on behalf of Marine Le Pen, and Marine Le Pen's own niece, Marion Maréchal, running for Reconquête, which sort of contested them in the right-wing space. And so what's kind of interesting to me, if we're observing it within the French context, is that essentially we're putting into campaign form, European campaign form, a national ongoing party politics story, right? And so in a way that goes back to Daniela's starting off point about the second order elections, but maybe what's different this time around, rather than in 2014, is if I were giving this talk 10 years ago, we would have been talking about how the far right was already doing quite well in French sort of seat counts at the European level, right? So Front National has for years been using the European institutions as a means of gaining institutional footholds and getting their foot in the door. And that's now something that's become much more possible to do within French national level politics, right? Because the right wing does have a number of seats and representation in the National Assembly. And so this kind of interplay between national and European party politics and national and European elections is really something that's a bit new, and trying to figure out where to hit the messaging. Are we having a national debate in a European election or vice versa is something that's going to keep on coming up along the way. And then, of course, Macron is now at the end of his ability to continue to serve as president, and so there's all sorts of questions around succession within. Will this sort of center versus everyone model hold? And you're seeing the sort of old mainstream center-left and center-right parties trying to rehabilitate their image by running relatively high-powered candidates for the European Parliament elections, in some ways because they weren't as successful at the national elections and they're available, but also because they're interested in trying to sort of revive the brands of things like the Republicans or the Socialists and so on. So it'll be interesting to see, in a way, how these kinds of French midterms within Europe come out in terms of a result. And I think that also relates to the two other narratives that I'm keeping an eye on, the one around sort of the EP versus the EU narrative. At the EU level, we haven't said much yet about the Spitzenkandidat system, which I think is now pretty much dead, at least in terms of the way that it was envisaged 10 years ago. But we do still have lead candidates for each of the different party families. Many of them are ironically not actually running for election themselves in the European Parliament. Many of them are, such as, of course, von der Leyen not going to actually be a candidate in the election on the ballot per se. But there is still that kind of executive presidentialization of European politics that's kind of lurking behind the shadows, and that's something to kind of keep an eye on. And I think that contrasts quite interestingly with what probably the European Parliament would like to think of itself as doing. We've seen, for instance, a resolution coming out of the Parliament back at the end of 2023, reminding the Commission that it has the ability to scrutinize the executive after the elections, and expecting there to be this link between Parliament and Commission representation. And we just haven't seen that actually followed through. And then lastly, there's all sorts of national fingerprints across these contests themselves. A lot has been said already in the media about how many of the leaders of the different party families, many of the sort of Spitzenkandidat are themselves of German background, for instance. And so there's some national politics that spills into that as well. And so we're looking to see, of course, who will become the big winners for the Commission presidency as a result of this. So many different narratives, very messy always, and happy to keep on picking up these different fingerprints and narratives with some other things that Giada mentioned at the beginning, but I'll pass it back now to her for our final intervention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this absolutely interesting and fascinating America Franco perspective on the European Parliament. And now to Dr. Mary C. Murphy, last but absolutely not least.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Giada, and thanks to you and Ollie for the invitation and for keeping this partnership going. It's really great to see it flourishing in this way. The last speaker finished off by talking about messiness, and I'm going to add to the messiness because I've been asked to talk about Northern Ireland in particular. And I suppose the question that was posed was, what's the meaning of this election for not just the island of Ireland, but for Northern Ireland as a whole? And as we know, these are the first elections to the European Parliament since the UK left the EU. But of course, Northern Ireland isn't contesting these elections because it no longer has representation in the European Parliament. But when you think about it, Northern Ireland really is in a very unusual position in this context, because unlike the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland's relationship with the EU is exceptionally complex. And that's primarily because Northern Ireland continues to have access to the single European market. So for that reason alone, the European Parliament elections are consequential for Northern Ireland. And the composition of the European Parliament will be consequential for Northern Ireland and the future of the single market itself. Now, all of this has given rise to suggestions or maybe even allegations of a democratic deficit, which manifests itself in two key ways in Northern Ireland. So first of all, Northern Ireland citizens, they're subject to EU single market and customs rules, but they will have no directly elected members to the European Parliament, which is of course involved in defining and making those rules. And the second way in which the democratic deficit manifests in Northern Ireland is that Irish citizens in Northern Ireland, and remember, citizens of Northern Ireland under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement can be Irish, British, or both, they are by extension also European citizens, and yet they do not have the right to vote in the EU elections because they're not resident in an EU member state. Now, you couple all of this with the fact that back in 2016, Northern Ireland recorded a majority vote in favour of Remain during the Brexit referendum campaign. And you also need to consider that for many EU citizens living in the UK, which is no longer a member of the EU, those EU citizens will be able to vote in the elections if their country of origin allows their citizens to vote from abroad. And at the moment, 23 EU member states do allow their citizens to vote from abroad. But the problem for Northern Ireland is that the Republic of Ireland is not one of these 23. So the key factor here is that the Good Friday Agreement established that people born in Northern Ireland, they can choose to hold Irish or British citizenship or both. That means an entitlement to European citizenship for many. But in this case, it does not extend to an entitlement to vote in these EU elections. Now, the issue can, technically speaking, be addressed because in essence, it's a national matter for every country in the EU to decide how and if to enfranchise its citizens during particular elections. But I suppose this is a very specific case because there's so many citizens in Northern Ireland who are also European citizens, and that it does create something of a challenge, it has to be said, for the Irish government. But it's even more complex than that because any issues around identity are really difficult and really sensitive issues in Northern Ireland, full stop. So whereas nationalists may wish to have a vote in these elections, for many, many unionists, they would see that as Northern Ireland being treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. So just to give you some context for all of this, after the Brexit vote, and as Catherine has alluded to, or at least after the UK's departure from the EU, the Republic of Ireland was allocated an extra seat in the European Parliament. Now, way back before this happened, or around about the time that this happened, there were calls primarily by Sinn Féin, but also by the SDLP, to give the Republic of Ireland's extra seat to Northern Ireland. And it was something actually that Guy Verhofstadt, the European Parliament Brexit negotiator, also raised. In 2023, when we were redrawing European Parliament boundaries, European constituency boundaries here in the Republic of Ireland, Sinn Féin repeated this call. But none of the other political parties in the Republic of Ireland chose to do so. The problem has been recognised. It's been recognised formally by the Special Select Committee on the Withdrawal of the UK from the EU, a report from the Irish Senate, They made two recommendations in relation to the suggestion and the allegation of a democratic deficit. They called for greater clarity in relation to the impact on voting rights in Northern Ireland. They recommended that the Irish government examine the potential for Irish citizens in Northern Ireland to vote in these elections. And they also made a second recommendation to call on the Irish government to ensure that the voice of citizens in Northern Ireland is properly represented at EU level. Now, in effect, none of these recommendations have been acted on, and there are fears around that, about acting on it, because there is a fear that if you extend the franchise to this extent, or if you tinker with the way in which representation happens, that it would be destabilizing, that it would be contested, but also that it would actually be electorally damaging for the parties in the Republic of Ireland, because they would be competing even more so with Sinn Féin in particular. Now, the DUP and Unionists are utterly against these proposals, and they see this as being, any suggestion of this as being contrary to the Good Friday Agreement. So there's an enormous amount of contention around this particular issue, and it hasn't effectively been resolved. It's not a subject of intense or even mild discussion, to be frank, in Northern Ireland at this moment in time. But nevertheless, I think it is important that we remain attuned to it, because the way in which it will play out will be quite interesting. There's only one Northern Ireland figure contesting a European Parliament seat in the Republic of Ireland. And that's the Northern Ireland MP, Sinn Féin MP, Michelle Gildernew. If she wins her seat, that will precipitate a Westminster by-election. We may also have by-elections in the Republic of Ireland as well, because a number of sitting TDs are running for seats as well. So again, there might be electoral contestation around that. But an important point to make about Michelle Gildernew as a Fermanagh-based Northern Ireland MP running for the European Parliament, her messaging in terms of her campaigning is that the North's future is within the European Union as part of a united Ireland. She's very explicitly speaking about the constitutional question, and she's potentially, her and her other elected representatives, should Sinn Féin win 4 seats, will be bringing that message to Brussels. And in many ways, there'll be no counter to that message in Brussels, because there will be no unionist representation and there will be no British representation either. So that's really just one of the ways, and it's perhaps a significant way in which Brexit kind of continues to complicate life in Northern Ireland, because it has changed what was a previously settled context, and it's opened up new political challenges, and it's probably created unwelcome avenues for disagreement between the blocs and the communities in Northern Ireland at a time when things are already somewhat destabilised by the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I'll leave it at that, Giada.
Thank you so much for this. Again, it's incredible to reflect on our never before seen status as within and outside the European Union can still create more complications and more issues that had ever been anticipated, but apparently, and of course, nothing about Brexit or the post-Brexit period had been thought about or anticipated.